variables and modifying variables. Now, as you've already seen, I've modified a variable by changing a color. That's one way. And let's just take a quick second to discuss game level attributes. And the attribute term and variable term, you'll hear me kind of interchange it, is pretty common. GameSolid calls it an attribute. In the real coding world, it's called a variable. So don't get confused by the language. If I say variable, it's an attribute. Attribute is a variable is an attribute. It's different words for the same, with the same meaning. So we have game level attributes, and game level attributes means that they can be accessed globally. They can be accessed from any scene, anywhere in your game. Scene level attributes and actor level attributes can only be accessed from that individual scene. So I can go ahead and like make scene level attributes, like when you pick an attribute type like here, but those attributes can only be accessed during the time that that scene is active. So they're not really used a whole lot. I would stay away from them. I think most people tend to use self attributes, they're called, which you can create inside an actor like this, the same thing, and the actor can monitor something that you may want to send information to it to store it from from another place where you have a number or an attribute, say that's related to an actor's self, or a number that you want to set that you want this actor to reference all the time, say like a position, an X and Y, that you want it to return to. So you can use a self attribute because it's related to that actor, and no matter which scene that actor is, it'll have access to that information inside itself when it's present on the scene. So there are different ways to go about using attributes. So let's do a real basic. Let's take a minute first to talk about the different types of attributes. So let's go ahead and let's just make a couple self ones. Let's just start there, and let's just talk about the different types of attributes. Now we have, as I've described, the first type, which is a Boolean, which is basically a true or false, on or off condition, and you toggle it like you would turning a switch on. It starts off in the false condition, and you change it to true. But you always have to remember that, yes, sometimes when a scene restarts, it'll retoggle it back to what's called its default or basic condition. But you always have to turn it back to the opposite direction. It's like a switch. Once it's turned on, it'll stay on until you turn it off. And that's logic. Everything in GameSolid, don't get confused that some things are being done kind of behind the scenes, automatically, like calculating, the speed to go from one position to another or whatever. GameSolid does some things for you, but most of the things, when you're dealing with variables, you have to, if you change a condition and you want it to go back, you need to change it back, or it'll stay in that position, because the computer's stupid. If you tell it to change color, it doesn't know that you originally picked, black. It starts off as black. It doesn't know that. You need to tell it, oh, you're red now, you need to be black again. We have a text attribute, which deals with keyboard input. It deals with text, ASCII to text. It deals with language, letters that represent. It deals strictly with letters, interprets everything as letters. So we're telling the computer how it interprets this information. We have integers, which are basically numbers that do not have decimal places. They're whole numbers. Okay, and then we have real attributes, which are decimal places, numbers with decimal places. Then we have angle, which is kind of self-explanatory, 0 to 360. Okay, and then we have indexes, which is very similar to an integer. I'm not 100% certain, and I may look it up on the GameSolid cookbook. There's a whole definition of all this stuff, exactly what the difference between an integer and an index attribute is. But an index attribute functions in the same way that an integer does, in that it doesn't use decimal places. Okay, so let's just go ahead and let's manipulate something. Let's manipulate a variable in GameSolid. And so we'll start with a rule, because when we use rules, rules are basically similar to what we call if statements in code. In other words, a rule means if, or when, if, and we can come up here and change this little condition to all or any, and that's going to relate to those things that we set, these variables, okay? Even a mouse touch is a variable. The screen can be touched or it can't be touched. It's a variable, okay? And so we can begin to build what we call an if statement. If all these conditions are valid, so let's say if the actor receives an event and it's touched and it's pressed, okay, if that happens, all right, then we want to modify a variable. We want to modify an attribute. So we're going to go over here and we're going to grab what is called a change attribute or a change a variable behavior. And we're going to go in here and we're going to say, let's change something. We want to change. So what do we want to change? Well, let's change the width of this actor. That's variable. So we're going to click on this. We're going to open the attribute or variable browser, and we're going to look and see at what variables we can modify. So we're going to click on the actor, and because that's where the arrow tells us where its variables are, and we see a whole list of variables that we can modify. And so we're going to go in here and we're going to say let's modify the size of the variable. So we're going to modify its number, which is more than likely, probably, as we see over here, is a real attribute that we're modifying. So let's go ahead and modify its width. So we're going to modify its width, and well, what are we going to modify it to? Well, we know it's a real number, so we can modify it to anything, even sizes with decimal places. So we can basically type in a number here. So we're going to modify this number 100. So let's modify it. Let's say we're going to modify you to 50. Okay? So now what we've just done is we've said if all conditions are valid, and the only condition we have is that if touch is pressed, we're telling the computer to change the size in relationship to the width of this attribute to 50. All right, so let's go ahead and just back up, and let's go ahead and let's pull this actor on the scene, and let's just go into preview, and there we have our actor, and we touch it, and we see the width has changed. Now see, when I press it again, right, when I press it again, nothing happens, because I don't have any statements in there that are telling it to change back. I've just told it to change. And that's all the computer's going to do. It's going to do exactly what I told it to do in relationship to those variables. It's going to just change. So if we go in here and we go into the otherwise section, and otherwise means is if these conditions are not valid, so it's anything in the otherwise is going to be the exact opposite of your if or rule. So it's going to say, so this, basically you could say in otherwise, you can say if these conditions are not valid, you could almost put that down in here, then do this. In other words, if touch is not pressed, then do this. If it's pressed, do this. So what this does is reverses the condition or reverses the statement. This is what otherwise does in GameSalad. It allows you to have that. We call it a switch. It switches it back or reverses it without us having to add a whole bunch of other code like, oh, if I touch it again or do whatever. So now we can simply go down here to and we can say we want to change an attribute. We want to tell the computer what to change the width back to. So we're going to go in and we're going to say actor 1. We're going to go to your size variable. We're going to go to the width. And we're going to say back to 100. So now what we're doing is we've explained it, telling the computer what to do, all right, in each condition. So let's go ahead and press preview. And we're going to touch it. We'll hold the button down now. When we let it go, it's going to go back because it's not pressed. And that's the thing about these conditions in the if statement, these attributes. that you need to understand is that touch, when touch is pressed is like a momentary button. When you touch it, it's active. When you release it, it's not active. When you want to touch something and hold its condition, then you go ahead and do when touch is released. Okay, so if we do touch is released, we're going to see that it's going to stay there. The otherwise command is not going to work now because we've used a different condition, a different variable. We've used touch is released. Now if we touch it now, we're going to get the reverse effect. See how this stuff works? Because now what we're doing is touch is no longer released, touch is pressed. I know that may seem a little confusing, but now we're touching it, it's pressed, okay? And since we're using a released, the otherwise statement is kicking in and it's doing the exact opposite now. And this is where when you're learning to use BASIC, and when you're learning to use logic and you're learning to understand the code, the real power in this stuff is really learning to understand all these things up here, what touch and what overlap and what auto rotation and key and mouse button and all this kind of stuff, mouse position and these other types of operators that we'll begin to get into as this series kind of progresses, that you'll begin to see how these things work and what released actually means and how that affects the system. And touch is pressed. And so right there we just did a basic changing of variables, changing of attributes. We're just simply telling the computer, change these numbers, and the computer automatically adjusts the size because we've told it to change the size. We don't have to go in, and most engines or scripts, you don't even have to. If you were coding in JavaScript, you might have to write the vector things in there, but you don't have to do, people are mistaken when they think, well, when you're working in Unity or something, you've got to kind of code out all that, making that actor switch. No, you don't. There's language behind the scenes or sub-programs that handle that kind of stuff, and you call upon different little programs that are written in there that already do that. And most coding, even in Xcode or whatever, are like that. GameSolid just makes it a little bit easier by defining things with little windows around them. It's still code. This is still basically writing code and understanding logic. So that's just a basic beginning to understand what attributes are, and then in the next one we'll look at modifying some other types of attributes and see how those work and how we can apply those.